There is a word we use a lot at Praxis, the word redemptive. We are in the world to advance redemptive entrepreneurship. We want to see redemptive businesses, redemptive nonprofits, redemptive investors, redemptive philanthropists. And of course, this raises the question, what does this word mean, or what do we mean by it? And so we've been on a kind of long journey to define this word well. And maybe just as important as defining it, to find stories that illuminate it. And one way of looking for such a story is to ask, if you asked Jesus of Nazareth to tell you a story of redemption, what story would he tell? And I've become convinced that there is a story that Jesus would have told, that in fact, probably any rabbi of the first century would have told, if you asked for a story of redemption. And it's found in the biblical book of Ruth. This is a story we've come to believe that illuminates for us what we actually ought to be about in the world by showing us a small cast of characters making an amazing set of choices that in the end change the course of history as well as their own stories and lives. How does the story begin? Well, you may have some memory of it. It begins in a quite striking way with a catalog of calamity. It begins this way in Ruth chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, already in the first phrase, invoking the collapse of civil order, the civil war at the end of the book of Judges, which immediately precedes Ruth in the Old Testament. That civil war incited by the violent rape and murder of a woman that leads to the extinction of an entire tribe, a terrible time in Israel. In those days, the book of Ruth says, there was a famine in the land. So now we have famine, food insecurity. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab. Now we have emigration forced almost certainly by economic and perhaps political circumstances. He and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife, Naomi. And the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died. So now, just 3 verses in, this man who has been the provider and protector in a patriarchal world for his wife and his sons has died early, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. Now we have the complexities of intercultural marriage. The name of one was Orpah and the other Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. Again, loss, perhaps through disease, perhaps through hunger. In any case, without children, so childlessness, another level of calamity, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. What a way for this story to begin. And when Naomi returns at the end of chapter 1 to her hometown of Bethlehem, she's barely recognizable, and the women of that town ask, is this Naomi? And it's very interesting what she says. She says, call me no longer Naomi, which is a Hebrew word that sounds like the word for sweet. Call me Mara, a word that sounds like the word for bitter. For the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? Naomi has lived a life from sweet to bitter, and her complaint is ultimately against God. I think it's amazing that the Bible includes these kinds of stories. The Bible, which is a story of the Lord, acting mostly for good, includes people who at certain moments in their lives say, the Lord has dealt harshly with me. And it's interesting that I think this is not just a story that applies only to those who have experienced true kind of geopolitical catastrophe, personal loss. It's strangely a story from bitter to sweet that seems to be part of almost every human story, probably part of your story, certainly part of mine, and even part of the story of very successful and prosperous people. Tony Fadell is one of the most accomplished inventors of our age. He was the principal inventor of the iPod, and then on the team that invented the iPhone. He's been part of creating some of the most successful consumer devices in history. And in an interview he gave a few years ago, thinking about his own teenage children and the iPhone in particular, he said this: "I wake up in cold sweats every so often thinking, what did we bring to the world?" Tony Fadell, who invented this thing that probably most of us adopted, the first time we got one, we felt kind of a rush of sweetness and possibility and genuine benefit, is haunted by this feeling of bitterness. And don't we sense that even these good things that have come into our lives have brought with them complication and loss and sorrow and disappointment? This transition from sweet to bitter is in some ways the human condition, but Naomi has lived it in the maximum way, lost so much, now returns with her daughter-in-law to Bethlehem, which to us might sound not so bad, a little town of Bethlehem. But in this time, it's one of the worst places that two unprotected, unaccompanied women, vulnerable individuals, could go, because the murder that set in motion the civil war in the book of Judges was the murder of a woman traveling with her common-law husband, who is only known in the text as the Bethlehemite. She's also from Bethlehem. And so Bethlehem, at the end of the book of Judges, at the beginning of the book of Ruth, is a byword for exploitation, for violence, for danger. And it is to Bethlehem that Naomi feels compelled to return. She just has one thing going for her. Her daughter-in-law, unlike Orpah, who kisses her mother-in-law and goes back to her town, back to Moab, trying to make a life after the loss of her own husband, Ruth, against the protests of Naomi, has made this beautiful poetic speech. Wherever you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. Your God, the God you are so bitter towards, will be my God. Where you're buried, I'll be buried. Ruth has declared and is now going to live out her covenant love, this beautiful Hebrew word, hesed, faithful covenant love, for Naomi to the end of their days. And these two women go back to Bethlehem. And there's just one other little note of hope in the text. They came to Bethlehem, it says at the end of Ruth 1, at the beginning of the barley harvest. Ruth and Naomi, incredibly vulnerable, beset by calamities, come back to a town where in at least one field, there is a kind of ethical system. The system prescribed in the law called gleaning, in which the poor of the land, people who did not have their own land to harvest, were given the dignity of work along the edges of the fields, because a faithful, ethical landowner of this time would obey the law and leave the edges of his fields for others to harvest. So Ruth and Naomi come back and find that one of their distant relatives, Boaz, has a field where this ethical system is in place. Ruth goes to glean in the field. And when Ruth arrives, Boaz notices her and notices the vulnerability of an unattached immigrant woman in an environment with many young men far from supervision and far from safety. And Boaz says to the young men who work in the fields, "Do not bother her." And everyone in that world knows what he means. Ruth has found her way to an environment that is an ethical environment. And I think ethical systems have these two qualities. One is safety, interrupting patterns of exploitation, making sure that even the vulnerable are protected. Boaz explicitly does that for this new young woman gleaning in his field. And opportunity, the opportunity to have the dignity of fruitful work, meaningful action. Boaz has kept that alive in his field as well through this ethical practice of gleaning. And we've come to believe at Praxis that ethical is the baseline for us as Christians, as followers of this story, that we want to create environments of safety and opportunity. And Ruth and Naomi have, by the grace of God, found themselves in an ethical place. But we've also come to believe at Praxis that ethical is not quite enough when exploitation is running the field. Boaz's field is ethical, but the very fact that he has to instruct the young men not to bother this new arrival suggests to us that there are fields perhaps quite nearby where exploitation is quite routine and taken for granted. The broader context that Boaz and Ruth and Naomi live in is one of violence, degradation, the lack of dignity, disappointment. And ethical is not enough in those situations because it doesn't actually restore what exploitation has damaged. You can be ethical in your own environment, but what's happening in the next field, let alone the next region or the next country? And Ruth and Naomi have lost so much. What can restore what they've lost? Not just being able to glean enough for a day. Something more is needed. And probably what we should call that something more is redemption. So what do we mean by this word redemption? Well, I want to offer a phrase that has become meaningful to us, that perhaps what redemption really means is creative restoration through sacrifice. Maybe the most important word here is the word restoration. Something's been broken, something's been lost, and what is needed is for something to be repaired and restored. This distinguishes redemption, I think, from other visions of how the world might get better, how the world might be perhaps improved. One is to distinguish from technological progress, or a kind of vision of progress in which we'll just keep inventing new things that make the world better. But in fact, we find that even all the technological progress we've had doesn't actually repair and restore what legacies of exploitation have broken. And perhaps that's part of why, even after inventing amazing things, an inventor can wake up in cold sweats, wondering, have I really restored anything in the world, even through all the progress I've brought into the world? Restoration also does not mean merely a return to the past, kind of rewinding the clock to some time when it seems like things went better for people at least like us. Restoration is not just about going back in time. The disciples of Jesus had a hard time understanding this. There's this very interesting moment after the resurrection of Jesus when they've come together and Jesus is in their midst. And when they come together, Luke says in Acts 1, they ask Jesus, Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom to Israel? They're imagining a kind of rewind. They're remembering when a descendant of David sat on the throne and things seem to be going right for Israel and for people like them. And Jesus replies, it's not for you to know the times or periods that the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you. And you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Jesus basically says, you have no idea what's about to happen. I'm not here just to rewind for the benefit of the people of Israel. You are going to be a kind of new Israel spreading into the whole earth. And what are you going to bring? A kind of power that has not been seen before, a kind of creative restoration. Because redemption is actually not just about repairing what's been broken to the state it was before. It always has this creative element. It introduces new possibility, opens up new avenues for creative direction. And mysteriously but consistently, this creative restoration seems to come through sacrifice. What do we mean by sacrifice? I suppose that the essential element underneath this word sacrifice is surrender and loss. Surrender, the willingness to lose something, giving something up that you might have held on to, and the willingness to lose it. Though I think there is another pattern that may be just as common, that is also sacrificial, which is loss that you never would have chosen, shouldn't have chosen, couldn't have chosen, that you nonetheless surrender to God and trust can be used for good. Naomi has lost her husband. She never could have or should have chosen that loss. Ruth has lost her husband. But in response to her losses, Ruth says, I surrender this. I'm going to actually embrace it, offer it up to God, and believe that there's a creative future ahead. So whether it takes the form of surrender that's willing to lose or loss that is willing to surrender, sacrifice involves consecrating our losses, trusting that God can do something new and beautiful with them. It's when people sacrifice that creative restoration is unlocked. Sometimes it's very routine. Boaz, in a way, by allowing gleaning every day, has this kind of routine surrender of something he could have held on to, crops he could have harvested for his own account. But the most powerful kind of redemptive acts in any story are acts of radical sacrifice. And this, of course, is what happens at the kind of climax of the book of Ruth. When Ruth, who has been gleaning in Boaz's field and has benefited from his ethical system, goes to Boaz's threshing floor in the middle of the night in this kind of crazy scene that is not exactly PG, and approaches him as he's sleeping on the threshing floor and pleads with him to make a far more radical sacrifice on behalf of her and her mother-in-law, for he is their kinsman. And there's this ethical idea in the law of the kinsman redeemer, the person who steps in and buys back land or a family that's been lost to death or debt. And Ruth says to Boaz, will you step in and play that role? And Boaz says a very interesting thing. He says, well, there's actually someone nearer than I. There's a nearer kinsman. I'm going to step in. Boaz doesn't have to do this ethically, but because he's come to love and admire Ruth, he steps in to do it redemptively. The next day he goes to the gate. He buys away from that ethical redeemer the right to be a redemptive redeemer, the right to actually marry Ruth, take on the line of Elimelech. And that sets in motion this beautiful redemptive story through a huge redemptive risk. What is the game that Ruth and Boaz are playing here? There are kind of three games you can play in life, and you may be familiar with these ideas from game theory. There's the win-lose game, the zero-sum game, in which all my winning comes at your expense. This is a finite game with one round. We play this game, if we can get away with it, only one time, because this is fundamentally an exploitative game, a game of exploitation, maybe the default game in human lives. I win, you lose. There's another game that we talk about, which is the win-win game. I win, you win. This is a positive sum game where we find a way to work together where both people benefit. And this is a finite game. That is, we can walk away from it at any time, but we'll play many rounds. I'll do business with you many times if I find that you're an ethical person. And it's the ethical way. And there's nothing wrong with win-win games, and we should seek to play win-win games whenever we can. But Ruth and Boaz end up playing a different game, and we would call this the redemptive game. And what is the pattern of this game? If exploitative is I win, you lose, ethical is I win, you win, is the redemptive game I lose, you win? Do you want to play that game? This is a question that occurred to the disciples of Jesus as well. And it's set out very clearly at one moment in the Gospel of Mark when Peter began to say to Jesus, look, we have left everything and followed you. Peter basically says, Jesus, you realize how much we have surrendered, how much we've been willing to lose. Who is winning in this game? And Jesus said, truly, I tell you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for my sake and for the sake of the good news, who will not receive 100-fold now in this age. Houses, brothers and sisters, mothers and children, and fields with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. Peter basically asks, are we playing an I lose, you win game? And Jesus says, no. You are actually unlocking creative restoration. There is actually going to be 100-fold return now in this age, Jesus says. Have you lost your house? You're going to have 100 houses. Do you have 100 houses? I actually think anyone who follows Jesus has 100 houses. I think I have 100 houses in the sense that if tonight I needed a home, a place to stay, I think without a doubt there are 100 places, not Airbnbs, places I could go because of my connections to others in the family of Jesus, where I would be received as a family member. I would have a place to stay. I only own one house as it happens, but I have access to easily 100 houses. Jesus says we're playing a new kind of game, and maybe the best name for it is I sacrifice, we win. Yes, there is sacrifice. Something is surrendered. Something may be lost. But that act of sacrifice creates a new community. It creates a we. The other two games are IU games. They're arm's length games. We can walk away anytime. But genuine acts of redemptive sacrifice actually bind us together with other people in such a way that we win together. When Boaz says yes to Ruth, when Ruth goes with Naomi to her hometown of Bethlehem, they create a we, a new community. And together they experience multiples on investment. Jesus says 100-fold. You're going to get 100x back. This is an infinite game in the sense that we never walk away from it. We're bound together in a new way. We'll never walk away. And it's the essence of the redemptive game. What are the returns on this way of life? Well, let's just look at who's redeemed in the story of Ruth. Naomi is redeemed. By the end of the story, she's a grandmother. Her life is sweet again. She experiences joy again. She's been brought back to life again. Elimelech, in a way, is redeemed. Remember him? He was dead even before the story began, long gone. And yet, his name is kept alive. His line is kept alive. We are talking about him today because Boaz and Ruth made their redemptive choices. Maybe most beautifully, Bethlehem is redeemed. This place that was a byword for exploitation, violence, and danger becomes a byword for covenant love, for hesed, for faithfulness, a place where women are protected, where families are knit back together, a place where justice is done. O little town of Bethlehem, we're only singing that because Ruth and Boaz chose the redemptive way. And of course, we sing about Bethlehem because they had a son named Obed. Obed had a son named Jesse, and one of Jesse's sons is named David, the king who begins to restore in Israel a kind of right worship, right rule that repairs and creatively restores the chaos at the end of the book of Judges. And David is the great-great-great-grandfather of the ultimate redeemer, the one who steps into the story willing to surrender everything, suffers the loss of everything, and in doing so, restores everything, and invites us to live a redemptive way.